Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Back for another episode. This is Frank Agan, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. Thanks again for those who are tuned in and those who have subscribed. For those who are longtime listeners, or consistent listeners, I should say, you know that we have guests on occasionally, great people who share their insights and their ideas. Today, I have with me Paul Edwards. Paul is he's a mastermind expert. He's a teacher. He's a connector. He hosts a podcast called the Influencer Networking Secret Podcast. And if I haven't indicated, he's an author. And the name of his book is Beyond Business: How to Gain Magnetic Influence, Meaningful Connections, Profitable Publicity by Becoming a Radically Generous Entrepreneur. Paul, welcome.
Frank, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Good. All right, let's just jump right into it. I love the title on the book. What is magnetic influence and how do we gain it?
Oh, well, I'm very glad you asked that question because I'll start by I like to start by telling people, first of all, what it's not.
Okay.
And that way we can segue into what it is. And so in chapter 2 of my book, the main title is The Monastic Heart, but then the subtitle of it is Be a Magnet, Not a Pusher. And what I was attempting to illustrate in this from the stories that you'll read in there is that I started out like most everybody who gets good at networking and building relationships and connecting with people. I started out as an awkward, pushy salesman. I started out as a guy who walked into a room full of entrepreneurs and didn't know what to say to them. Other than, do you want to buy insurance, right? I know I'm supposed to say that because my job was selling insurance. But it didn't take me long. It didn't take more than a few times of doing that to figure out that nobody wanted to talk about that. And although I was extremely ignorant about this process at the time, I will take a slight bit of credit for being cognizant enough to say to myself, okay, well, if they don't want to talk about insurance, then I'm not going to talk about insurance, and I'm going to keep asking myself, what do these people want to talk about? And then I'm going to talk about that. I understood enough about the laws of human nature, the natural laws that are all around us and invisible, but are plainly present in the motivations and actions that we carry out, to say to myself, this is clearly not the subject that is preeminent in people's minds. So I withdrew. I didn't stop going to networking. I didn't walk away, with my tail between my legs and that kind of thing. I just started going and keeping my mouth shut for a change. And I went from having conversations that were forced and awkward and pushy to starting to pick up on common themes. I started to listen to what each person said, right, at some of these groups. I would listen to, and then in one-on-one conversations, I would not talk about insurance, but I would instead just make conversation as though I was making conversation with somebody at a dinner party or, at a social gathering. And over time, because I was traveling in the business circuit, right? So you're talking about chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs, real estate, and all of their affiliate gatherings, just groups that I would find online that were aimed primarily at solopreneurs and small business owners. I found that they all had a lot of things in common. They might deliver a different product or service, but the end game was the same: grow a business, get more customers, attract more leads, get more people in my doors so that I make more sales, and therefore, I have a profitable business, or if they're an employee, but they're in a marketing or sales role, I make more sales, I build a good book of business, a good clientele, et cetera, et cetera. And so then I began to cross-reference that with my biblical background and my background in studying, in reading books like How to Win Friends and Influence People. I'd read it many times growing up.
Right.
And I began to see, oh, okay, so I know now I know what these people want to talk about. So instead of talking about insurance, I'm going to talk to them about what they want to talk about. And it didn't take long before a friend of mine who saw this in me, he saw that I was reverse engineering my success by first giving the people in these groups information or tips or ideas or connections that they wanted.
This was after your epiphany.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
He said to me, you should do a presentation on networking and building relationships. You should actually create a PowerPoint or whatever and get up and talk about it. And I had never thought of that before. But it didn't take me long to say, okay, well, that would put the spotlight on me for an additional 12 to 15 minutes beyond what I already get in any group that I'm in, assuming they'd let me do it. So I started with the groups where I had the most the deepest ties, and they said, absolutely, we'd love to have you do it. So I would go and I would give this presentation. And that's where I started to come up with sayings like, be a magnet, not a pusher, or not for profit is for profit, which is another chapter of my book. I started to see that very often, especially in sales, marketing, entrepreneurship, what we would naturally assume is important to emphasize. We sell this, we make that, we do this, we do that. Your audience, if they're entrepreneurs especially, could care less about that, right? Because they're all thinking the same thing. I make this, I sell that, I deliver this, and this is my, and I want to increase the impact and the profits and the revenue and the profile of my business. So when I began to teach this, people began to see connections, and they started actually following what I did. And several of them came back to me and said, I'd never thought about trying this event strategy the way you recommended it, this trade show the way you recommended it. I never thought about going up to people and leading off with what they wanted rather than what I wanted. And when I did it, I saw success. I got exactly what I was looking for, and I didn't even have to ask for it. And that's my whole point in being a magnet. What you end up doing is you make it very, very difficult for people to say no to you when you actually come to them with a valid need that they can fulfill after you have spent gobs of time taking care of them.
As I hear you talk, I hearken back to my early days when I was in private practice of law, and I was the exact same way. And I joke about it. I tell people I was that guy at the networking event, the chamber function, running around handing out cards like I'm, in Vegas, dealing cards, and feeling it just didn't feel good. This just isn't natural. I'm feeling like I need to come away with business. How do I close people? And not really knowing what I was doing. And it was almost comforting at some point, Paul, where I realized that, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go to events and just try and meet people. And when I kind of took that step back, and I don't know that I was as clear on it as you are, but I just took a step back in just trying to meet people and saying, I'm an attorney. I know I'm going to have clients that might need financial advisors. I'd love to hear about you. Mm-hmm. As I started to do those things started to come to me, and it felt good in the process. So this is fascinating. Not that I was, I'm the only person on the planet to have the only experience, but I guess the other thing that fascinates me about it is this. After all these years, it's been 25 years since I've started in private practice. After all these years, most people still haven't figured it out. You have a thriving business doing what you're doing, teaching, you're selling books, coaching because people haven't figured it out. If everybody figured it out, you'd be out of a job, right? You'd be back selling insurance. It's probably a sobering thought for you.
Well, I like to call myself a recovering insurance agent, but I borrowed that from John Corcoran, who's a recovering lawyer. So it's
that's me. Yeah.
There's nothing new under the sun, right, Frank? And that's the whole thing. Is I'm teaching stuff that has been taught for millennia.
Yeah.
Right. This is, and I've always told people the reason that I am so open about my faith and my biblical background when I teach is because that's where I'm getting it from. I'm not exercising anything that isn't duly established by God here. And I'm not, and it's nothing that is not written down in stone if you're willing to look at it and read it in all across the Bible. And in fact, you can find this in other religions too, using the same concept. You can find examples of radical generosity anywhere you look. And that's one reason I've always joked that in my mastermind, being a devout believer is going to help you access some of what I teach more readily. But I know people who have no connection to a church or to the same faith that I have, who nonetheless follow the same principles, and that principle still applies. It's a law of the universe. It applies whether you believe in its source or not. Anyway, what I'm getting at there is I've dealt with the imposter syndrome of thinking, I just teach the same thing over and over again, and once people have heard it, they've heard it, and they don't need to hear it anymore. Baloney. People, this is like advertising. If you don't teach this stuff 8, 10, 15, 200 times if necessary before it really sinks into through those thick craniums, right? Before people really begin to listen to it and really begin to think, wow, I've never tried it that way, and everything else I've tried has been a bomb. Why don't I try it the way Edwards talks about it, And it turns out the way Edwards talks about it is no different than the way anybody else talks about it. You just haven't taken the time to pay attention. Right.
Well, it's almost like they stumble on it in a happenstance. I wrote a fable type book called The Champion, and in The Champion, the protagonist is the guy who's that guy running around to events and pitching, wanting people to send him referrals, and one person in particular is trying to coach him. Doesn't work. Through a series of events, he ends up with laryngitis and finds himself at an event not able to talk, and people remarking what a great listener he is. So it's almost like we stumble on these things, it's. And I tell people as well, these are things you need to do, and it's almost like they think there's a shorter way. They think there's a shortcut. That's great. I hear what you're saying. It doesn't apply to me. Radical generosity. How do you define radical generosity?
I love this question because I think in a lot of people's minds, they're thinking you write big checks to nonprofits and foundations and stuff like that. And I know radically generous entrepreneurs who do that, but that's about the furthest thing from the definition that I could think of. So if you were to look at my book as a whole, you're looking at about 6 or 7 facets of the person who embodies this. And so I'll read them off really quickly, and then I'll explain them.
Sure.
The first one obviously is you're magnetic. You're not a pushy salesperson. The second one is you're a pro bono publicist, meaning you go out of your way to promote other people, right? You go out of your way to give them one more inch of publicity real estate than they would otherwise have, and you don't charge them a dime for it, right? And there's a number of ways you can do that, but one of the ways we're doing it is right now. We're having this interview. You're exposing me to your audience. And then when you come on my show and when I air this episode, you get exposed to my audience. That's pro bono publicity, right? And I didn't have to, you came, I think it was over podcast guests we connected, but I didn't have to go looking for it. You came to me. That's being a radically generous entrepreneur, right?
Well, I knew you had value to share. So it's a win-win, right? You have value to share? Go ahead.
Exactly. But the question is, who does that on average? right?
Yeah.
That's why it's a distinction. So continuing with my list.
Yeah, please.
Pro bono publicity. Then the next is not for profit is for profit. So you see tremendous passive economic value from giving generously, and that can be time, it can be talent, it can be treasure, it can be any number of things. You just your mere presence. An example of how I landed my largest premium dollar insurance client ever was by volunteering to MC a Miss America pageant, a local one, not the Miss America pageant,
Sure.
but a local one. And my co-hostess was part of a power couple that owned a huge empire in Centralia, which is a city south of Olympia, where I live in Washington State. And all I did was show up and get dressed up looking like Bond in a tuxedo and run my mouth for a couple hours,
Right.
Then I have a chapter called How to Network with Dream Connections, and that has quite a few subcomponents. I won't go into that now. I'll just say you become good at networking with people who perform at a much higher level than you, and I have a step-by-step process that I take people through in the book on how to do that. You also become very persuasive in print. So when you write, you don't just write blah, 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 on an email, right? Everything that you write is carefully thought out and composed and designed to elicit the desired response. And then the last one is you're also a curator. You're a connector. You don't just you're friendly to everybody, but not everybody gets into your circle, because you don't want to give radically generous entrepreneur. You don't want to give radical generosity away willy-nilly without consideration to who you're giving it to, because the concern is not just will I get something in return. The concern is, will this person pay it forward? Is this person likely to take what I teach and then teach it to somebody else, right?
Well, that's how it comes back to us. Because when you do something for someone else and they pay it forward, it kind of adds money to the economy, right? If you do something for somebody and they just go home and just kind of squirrel it away, then it's squandered. Is the way I look at it.
Correct. Awesome. Money's like that. It's I liken it to you got a room full of 100 people and everyone has a candle, but only one of them is lit.
Right.
Well, the rest of the room can get lit real easily. You just got to pass the flame.
That's a great analogy. All this is great value. I want to touch for a minute on your mastermind group. So essentially your business. You share wonderful value. You've got a wonderful book. But really what you're about is these mastermind groups, from what I understand. You want to talk about that?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm getting ready to start accepting people for a new group that I'm looking to launch probably I don't expect it to be ready until 2020 because this takes a lot of forethought. So let me give you the background.
Please, yeah.
I am a product of masterminds. Every successful period I've enjoyed in entrepreneurship and business has been when I've joined one. Because of the simple fact that human beings are a bit like the chemical compound of salt. Rabbi Daniel Lapin teaches this in his book, Business Secrets in the Bible. So salt is made of sodium and chlorine. Separately, they can be toxic and deleterious to our condition, but bind them together and they're delicious and they preserve meat and they make the roads drivable in the wintertime and yada, 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 right? So we're the same way. We're like salt. So bind us together, work together, and we do better, right? Keep us apart, isolated and alone, and we become, at best, self-destructive. So in putting this together, I looked back, I referenced back on masterminds I'd been a part of. And some of the best parts I found were, obviously, there's a lot of comparatively private networking to go on. When you have a lot of people who pay money to be part of a group, people who pay attention, and that means they pay attention to who they're around, and they start facilitating value in and amongst themselves. So that's one thing. Another thing is the opportunity to feature guest speakers. So all of these interviews that I'm doing now for my podcast give me great people to reach out and say, hey, I'd love for you to come and speak at my next mastermind and introduce you to my people and let them shake your hand and get to know you and all that. And it's a pro bono publicity. It's just another way that I can multiply value to people who I'm already exchanging it with. And then of course there's the whole, in the contemporary day, because of the way the online marketing world is exploding, there's an awful lot of people for whom the idea of traveling to a certain location, staying for a couple of days, and doing a 2-day event like that takes them out of all of the distractions of family and day-to-day life and their hometown and their familiar surroundings, and puts them in an environment where they are likelier to want to form those types of relationships and bond with people. And I just got back, as a matter of fact, last night from one in Los Angeles with my bestseller publishing mastermind coach, Rob Kosberg. And that's exactly what happened. I started meeting people, shaking hands, having conversations, and the next thing you know, I'm creating opportunities for them. So those are some of the foundational building blocks. The other thing that is really comes into play here is what I call strategic partnerships. And I learned this from Kevin. Why can't I remember? Kevin Thompson, who is the Relationship Accelerator Network. He's a good friend of mine. He's up here in Washington State as well. And this is where you meet people, like I mentioned at the outset, disparate people who ordinarily wouldn't know each other, don't know that they exist, but one has something that the other one is really looking for and has the money to pay for it. Now, this can be very small things like I just need a contract drawn up for $500.
Right.
Well, I'm going to connect an attorney to draw up a contract for $500, and I'm not even going to think twice about it. Here's the email, connect the two of them, business happens, there's a relationship created, great. I've been a radically generous entrepreneur. But then you get somebody who, they don't need a $500 contract. They need a $500,000 buyer for a commercial real estate deal. And that's where it gets a little more interesting, because now you can have the conversation. I may know someone who is exactly the right fit for that. And by the way, I'm going to send this person to you either way, right? But I'm curious as to whether or not you, if this were to go through, would you be willing to maybe shave off a finder's fee for me, kind of a part of the proceeds? So I don't want even 50% on a $500 deal, but I'll gladly take 10% on a $500,000 deal.
Right.
I'll gladly take even less than that. Because it's all I have to do is bring two people together. How easy is that in this day and age? So that's an example, and I touch on that. I don't get too deep into it because, of course, that's a very moving target. It's not a guaranteed type of thing, it's the kind of thing that happens in a mastermind group where you are very intentional about seating one person next to another. Right, like Jason Gaynard talks about in mastermind dinners, where you don't just bring a bunch of people in a room, say sit wherever you like, but you get to know these people ahead of time through your coaching calls and through your interactions leading up to the event, and then you are very systematic about and deliberate about saying, this person sits here, this person sits here, this person sits here, because you want them talking with each other, because you know what's going to happen when they do.
Gotcha. All right, here's the most important question.
Yes.
How does a listener get a hold of you? I mean, I think that's you've delivered great value. You have a system out there, a program. People are going to be interested, and there's no way in a short podcast we would be able to cover it all. And obviously, there's a million different scenarios, dozens of different things that people do, and it all impacts them in different ways. So you can't address it all. Somebody wants to call you, talk to you. How would they get a hold of you?
Well, thanks for asking that, Frank. And the easiest way to do that is my website, which is the Paul S. Edwards, Paul S. for Simon, Edwards.com. Anyone who goes to my website and subscribes to my newsletter, which I'm not a spam email marketer, you're not going to get 50,000 emails a week from me. Promise, take it to the grave. I do send out an occasional message, but it's usually my podcast digest if you haven't been listening for a while and you're interested in the interviews. But if you sign up for it, you get a free copy of Business Beyond Business. So, Frank, don't buy it on Amazon. I want you to get a free copy, and I'll mail you a hard copy if you want one. And if you don't want to sign up for the newsletter, that's okay. I'm here to build relationships. So if you just reach out to me on Facebook or something like that, and I'll make sure you get one. And if you are intrigued about the mastermind, I do have applications there. We're working on simplifying that, so anybody interested will also get an opportunity right away to apply for that. But there is a section on there to apply for the mastermind group as well. So keep that in mind if you're intrigued about that side of it.
Okay. Well, Paul, I really appreciate having you on there. For our listeners, again, it's paulsedwards.com. That's the best way to connect through him. He's provided a lot of value here. Appreciate having you on.
I'm sorry, Frank. It should be thepaulsedwards.com.
I'm sorry. All right.
I had to put the in front of it because there was another Paul S. Edwards who'd already taken the domain.
Well, for our listeners, Paul and I were joking before we got on because I was trying to find his book, and I went on Amazon and did a search, and there are all sorts of Paul Edwards books out there, including How to Rap Too, which is not his book.
Yes. I'm now an authority on hip hop, and I'm really excited to tell some of my friends about that. And who if you're listening.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Frank, thanks so much. It's been great. It's been great being on.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AMSPIRIT.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.